Okay. It is Monday, January 19th, 2026. And if you've been anywhere near a newsfeed in the last, 48 hours, you know exactly what the world is watching. The headlines are just, they're absolutely screaming.
They really are.
Western media is painting this picture of total systemic collapse in Tehran. They're comparing it to the Arab Spring, the fall of the Berlin Wall. The whole narrative is that the Islamic Republic is finally, after all these decades of teetering, in its death spiral.
It is the single biggest story on the planet right now.
Hmm.
But as we usually find when we actually dig into the documentation, the headline, it isn't just missing the nuance. It might be missing the actual story entirely.
That is exactly why I wanted to pull this specific deep dive together today. We're not looking at a CNN summary here. We are working off a brand new, really dense analysis that was published literally this morning in the Global Review. It's by Fried Novin, titled Iran and Multipolar Transition. And what struck me immediately is that Novin isn't interested in the emotional side of it, the rogue states or freedom fighters narrative. He's looking at the plumbing.
Right. He's stripping away the ideology to look at the structural machinery. His argument is that what we've been watching in Iran over the last couple of weeks, it's not some spontaneous explosion. It's a collision.
And not just a collision of protesters and police.
No, not at all. A collision between a very specific, calculated Western strategy of economic warfare and a surprisingly resilient Iranian state structure that has fundamentally changed how it operates over the last year.
So if you want to understand why the Grand Bazaar is burning,
you can't just look at the protests. You have to understand the mechanics of the June War and the financial strangulation that came right after.
So let's start with the money, because Novin argues this is the real trigger. The narrative we're hearing is, people are tired of the regime, and I'm sure that's true. But the source points to a mathematical reality that really forced the timing of this. We have to talk about the rial.
It always comes back to the currency. The velocity of the collapse here is... it's something we rarely see outside of total state failure. So we started 2025 with the Iranian rial trading at roughly 700,000 to the U.S. dollar.
Which was already a historical low, right?
It was. A very bad spot. But if you look at the chart for late December 2025, so just 3 weeks ago, it hit 1.4 million to the dollar.
Wow.
That is a 100% devaluation in 12 months.
So if I'm an average Iranian citizen, a teacher, a shopkeeper, my life savings, my ability to buy cooking oil, it's literally been cut in half.
Effectively overnight. And when you layer that on top of inflation that Novin pegs at nearly 60% annually, you're not dealing with political dissatisfaction anymore. You're dealing with a survival crisis.
Right.
But here is the critical distinction the paper makes, and he draws on the economist Jeffrey Sachs for this. This exchange rate volatility. It isn't just domestic mismanagement, though that's a factor. It's a transmission mechanism.
Meaning it's an engineered vulnerability. It's being used as a tool?
Exactly. This connects directly back to September 2025. You remember the UN snapback sanctions, the E3, the European powers. They triggered these mechanisms to really tighten the financial noose.
Oh, okay.
Novin's analysis, backed up by Sachs's framework, suggests this was a deliberate strategy to break the wage structure in Iran. The goal wasn't just to squeeze the government. It was to weaponize inflation against the general population.
It's the Venezuela playbook.
Precisely.
Yeah.
You create economic strangulation to the point where, as Sachs puts it, survival becomes a revolutionary act. You force people into the streets, not because they've suddenly adopted a new ideology, but because they literally cannot afford to stay home.
So the unrest is genuine, but the timing was basically manufactured by this financial pressure campaign.
Yeah.
And this all sets the stage for what happened on January 8th, because you have this population that is financially desperate, and that desperation creates the perfect cover for what the report calls instrumentalized chaos.
That's the pivot point. January 8, 2026. That's when the fog of war, descends. You have these coordinated calls for demonstrations from exile groups, but at the same time, the Iranian state just pulls the plug on the internet.
Total digital darkness. That's what Amnesty International called it.
Which makes verifying anything a nightmare.
We're suffering from what Novin calls epistemological uncertainty.
Yeah.
We barely know what's true. I mean, the Supreme Leader, Khamenei, came out on the 17th and admitted to several thousand deaths. Western intelligence is claiming tens of thousands. The gap is massive.
It is. But if you look closely at the security reports Novin cites, there's a very specific data point that it really changes how we interpret this. The report notes that 121 security personnel police Basij IRGC were killed
121. That is a huge outlier. You don't lose over 100 police officers to peaceful protesters holding signs.
Exactly. The number implies a kinetic, armed confrontation. You're seeing small arms fire, Molotov cocktails. This moves us away from the civil disobedience story and into a hybrid conflict one.
And the paper suggests this isn't just organic anger boiling over, that there's an accelerant being poured on the fire.
Instrumentalized is the word Novin uses. The grievances are real, people are hungry, but the intel points to external actors leveraging that hunger. For instance, the source highlights these reports of a convoy, 60 buses crossing from Iraq into Iran.
60 buses, that's a significant movement of people.
Yeah. Ostensibly, they were pilgrims, which is a common cover, but the report suggests they were fighters, deployed specifically to escalate the violence in those border provinces.
And that would dovetail with the activity we saw from Kurdish groups attacking IRGC bases in Kermanshah. It starts to look less like a riot and more like a coordinated, insurgency.
And we can't ignore the signaling from Washington. President Trump's statement this month, "We are locked and loaded." When you combine that rhetoric with threats of direct intervention, and then you see armed groups attacking police.
It's a provocation trap.
That's it. Novin argues this fits the classic definition of hybrid warfare. The goal is to amplify chaos to the point where the state creates a mass casualty event that justifies Western intervention. They want the IRGC to open fire.
Which provides the moral pretext for whatever comes next.
Exactly. But this leads to the question that I think confuses most Western observers. If the economy is destroyed and the streets are full of armed insurgents and the U.S. is threatening war, how is the Islamic Republic still standing? Why hasn't it collapsed yet?
And to answer that, we have to zoom out. We can't talk about January 2026 without talking about the elephant in the room, the June War of 2025.
Right. And this is where the Western narrative really, really falls apart.
So refresh our memory on the specifics there, because at the time, it really felt like the end game.
It was a 12-day direct conflict. Very intense. Israel carried out massive strikes on Iranian nuclear sites. The U.S. followed up with strikes on enrichment facilities. The assessment in Washington was that Iran had been degraded, that their strategic capabilities were broken.
But clearly that assessment was wrong.
Fundamentally wrong. The foreign minister, Arachi, claimed just this month that Iran has reconstructed everything. Now, usually you dismiss that as just propaganda.
Of course.
But Novin argues we have to take it seriously because the West completely missed the geopolitical pivot. They're still operating on the 2003 Iraq model, that if you bomb the infrastructure and sanction the banks, the state just crumbles.
But Iran isn't Iraq in 2003.
No, they've shifted east. They aren't isolated anymore. They are plugged into a completely different support system. You have the $400 billion 25-year investment deal with China. You have deep defense integration with Russia. We all know about the drone tech transfers, but it goes deeper now.
So when the West cut off the financial flows, China stepped in. And when the West bombed the facilities, Russian tech and Chinese supply chains helped rebuild them.
That's it exactly. Novin's argument is that this multipolar transition makes the old coercion tactics obsolete. You can't sanction a country into submission when the world's second-largest economy is underwriting their survival. It's like trying to siege a fortress that has a 4-lane highway open out the back door to Beijing.
It changes the entire calculus of resilience. And it's not just the great powers. We have to talk about the regional network, the so-called axis of resistance.
Yes. Hezbollah, the Houthis, the Iraqi militias. This is another area where the paper critiques the Western mindset. We tend to view these groups through a principal-agent lens.
Meaning we see them as puppets, Tehran pulls a string, and a Houthi in Yemen jumps.
Right. And the assumption is that if you cut the head off the snake in Tehran, the body dies. The proxies just wither away. Novin says this is a total fallacy. These groups are not just mercenaries. They are deeply embedded local political actors.
They have their own power bases.
For sure. Hezbollah delivers social services in Lebanon. The Houthis are woven into the tribal fabric of Yemen. They have agency and autonomy. So even if the Iranian regime vanished tomorrow, these networks wouldn't just disappear.
So the Western strategy of pressure Tehran to stop the proxies is flawed from the start.
It fails because Tehran doesn't have absolute control, and the proxies have their own local reasons for fighting.
Okay, so we have a resilient state backed by China and this decentralized network of allies. This brings us to the intellectual heavyweights, the source sites to critique the current strategy, John Mearheimer and Jeffrey Sachs.
Two very different thinkers, but they land on a similar warning.
Let's start with Mearheimer. He's the realist, the great power politics guy. His take on this is pretty dark.
Mearheimer argues that Iran is acting out of a classic security dilemma. They aren't being aggressive for the sake of ideology. They're reacting to what they see as existential threats.
Like having your nuclear sites bombed in June 2025.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That doesn't make you say, oh, we should stop. It makes you say, we need a bigger deterrent. But Mearsheimer goes further. He warns about the ultimate goal of the current U.S.-Israeli strategy. He thinks the goal isn't just regime change, it's balkanization.
Breaking Iran apart.
Yeah. Slicing it up into ethnic statelets, a Kurdish state, a Balak state, an Arab state in Khuzestan.
Like what we saw happen de facto in Syria.
Exactly. But Mearsheimer warns that this is opening Pandora's box. If you shatter Iran, you don't get a peaceful democracy. You get regional fragmentation that spills over into the entire Persian Gulf. You destabilize the energy supply for the whole world.
It's a recipe for a 30-year war. And then you have Jeffrey Sachs coming in with the economic critique.
And this is the paradox of sanctions. Sachs argues that economic warfare destroys the very class of people you need to build a democracy. Who gets wiped out by hyperinflation?
The middle class, the professionals, the people who want stability and reform.
Exactly. The teachers, the engineers, they get crushed. And who survives? The rate seekers, the black marketeers, the guys with guns and connections to the state who control the smuggling routes.
So by applying maximum pressure, we are starving the potential Democrats and feeding the hardliners.
You're enriching them. Sanctions create an artificial scarcity that makes the regime's network more powerful because they are the only ones who can bring goods in. It consolidates their control.
And despite all this, the strategy just seems to be escalating. The report mentions that tariff threat from January 12th.
The 25% tariff threat on any country trading with Iran, that is a massive escalation. That's the U.S. telling the world you were either with us or you were economically punished.
It's a maximalist strategy. Which brings us to the part of the paper I found most chilling, why maximalism failed. Because despite everything, the Islamic Republic is still standing.
It is, and the source uses Scott Ritter's concept of the escalation trap to explain why. The fundamental flaw in the U.S. strategy is that it lacks termination criteria.
Termination criteria, that's military speak for knowing when to stop, or what victory even looks like.
Exactly. Or knowing what winning looks like, short of total destruction. There's no clear definition of what Iran needs to do to make the pain stop, other than, total regime suicide. If you tell a government the only way we stop squeezing you is if you cease to exist, they aren't going to negotiate.
They're going to fight to the death.
And they are going to accelerate their nuclear program, correct?
Yeah.
If conventional deterrence fails, which it did in June, the only card left is the ultimate deterrent. The source implies the current strategy is virtually guaranteeing a nuclear-armed Iran.
So is there an off-ramp? Does Novin propose a solution, or is this just an autopsy of a disaster?
He does, but it requires a massive shift in mindset in Washington. He calls for strategic humility.
Strategic humility.
Yeah.
That's not a phrase we hear often in foreign policy circles. What does it look like in practice?
It means abandoning the fantasy of regime change. It means accepting that Iran is a permanent reality. The proposal is to set specific, achievable benchmarks. Not change your government, but limit enrichment to X%.
Transactional diplomacy.
Exactly. In exchange, you offer phased sanctions relief. You give them a reason to comply. And critically, you have to acknowledge the multipolar reality. You have to accept that Iran is now part of the Sino-Russian sphere. You cannot isolate them the way you isolated Libya. That world is gone.
It sounds like he's arguing for stability over satisfaction.
He is. He's arguing that we need to prioritize stability because the alternative is a failed state of 90 million people sitting on the world's most critical energy choke point.
Wow. When you put it that way, the stakes are incredibly high. It feels like we're watching a game of chicken where one side has thrown the steering wheel out the window.
And the other side is busy reinforcing their bumper with Chinese steel.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a disturbingly accurate metaphor.
So what's the bottom line here? We've got the economic collapse, the hybrid warfare, the geopolitical pivot. How should our listeners process the headlines they're seeing today?
I think the main takeaway is that the chaos in Tehran isn't just a news story about protests. It is the result of a collision between an outdated regime change playbook and a new multipolar reality. The Iranian state is battered, yes, but it is structurally different than the targets of the past. It has mutated.
It's a warning, really.
It is. It's a warning that if you misdiagnose the patient, the treatment can kill them. Or in this case, the treatment might create a monster.
And that's the thought I want to leave everyone with. We talk a lot about victory in these conflicts. But if the goal was to crush the regime, And the result is a militarized, nuclear hedging state that is economically married to China and hostile to the West. Has the strategy actually created a more dangerous opponent?
Sometimes the enemy you know is better than the chaos you create.
A sobering thought for a Monday. Thank you so much for breaking this all down.
My pleasure.
And to our listeners, next time you see a headline about a crisis in a foreign capital, look for the structural drivers. Look for the currency rates, the transmission mechanisms, because there is always more going on beneath the surface. We'll see you on the next deep dive.